got some books on liberalism. I just want to show them off. This one's The Theological Origins of Liberalism by Ismail Karun. Looks like this. It's a nice little cover. Just goes over the influences of Christian theology and liberalism, sort of thing. The relationship between philosophy and theology, the Protestant foundations of liberalism, or in liberalism, covenant theology, lost tradition, and communal liberty, grounding liberalism on Christian theology, liberal political theology of John Locke, theological foundations of liberalism and the tradition of natural law and natural rights, historical foundations of the contradictions in natural rights, liberalism, and legal pluralism as the way forward. Just want to briefly give you an idea what it's about. Like the Protestant foundations in liberalism. The roots of liberalism have generally been traced back to the Protestant Reformation. Many liberal principles started to take their form, beginning with the advent of Protestantism, although there are scholars who trace some principles of liberalism, such as individuality, well beyond the Reformation. The reform movement sweeping across Europe in the 16th century seems to be the decisive moment for the formation of basic liberal ideas. Of course, there are liberalistic ideas as early as the times of ancient Greeks, for instance, among the Athenian sophists. But if a time for the advent of basic liberal concepts should be determined, the Protestant Reformation seemed to be the best choice. In this respect, this chapter investigates how liberalism has thrived in the intellectual atmosphere that was brought about by the Protestant Reformation. It argues that Protestantism strongly contributed to the formation of basic liberal notions such as individuality, liberty, and equality, that Protestantism, to a certain extent, rationalized Christianity, thereby preparing for the general intellectual setting for liberalism, that the humanist teaching of the Protestant reform leaders harbingered of the liberal optimism about human nature, that Protestantism gave rise to a new type of economic man, thereby contributing to the rise of economic liberalism and capitalism, and the exhaustion from religion wars in the post-Reformation era contributed to the birth of the idea of religious toleration. This is in chapter 2. The birth of religious toleration as a result of exhaustion from religious wars. Two stimuli have played major roles in the development of the liberal principle of toleration: the gory experiences and the Protestant Reformation. This section examines how the exhaustion from religion wars after the Protestant Reformation triggered a widespread discussion of religious tolerance, and thereby contributing to the birth of firstly religious and then political tolerance, which fostered liberal democracy. The liberal principle of toleration in Europe is the product of a long process of sufferings and reformation of Christian theology, although it is hard to determine whether the historical experiences or the theological doctrinal reform had greater impact on the birth of this principle. It could be put forward that lessons derived from the bloody historical experiences preceded the theological arguments for religious toleration. It seems that historical experiences have shown the people the hazards of religious fanaticism, which called to the minds that religious tolerance must be inherent in Christianity, an argument that would later be systematically asserted by Locke. The result was the gradual emergence of the liberal principle of religious toleration that enabled different religious groups to live together peacefully. Talks about covenant theology. Covenant theology, social contract, doctrine, and definition of tyranny. This is in chapter 3. It says, Reformed theologians during the Protestant Reformation popularized the biblical idea of covenant, suggesting that society depended on an agreement among the ruler and God. God makes a tripartite covenant with a community and their civil magistrate. This Jewish idea was later cast into a secular notion of social contract by the early modern philosophers. In this respect, some scholars investigated the connection between covenantalism and contractarianism and searched for the transformation, if any, of the former into the latter. Lazar, for example, argues that covenanting comprises two types as strong and weak. The strong covenantalism, which was explicitly religious and therefore orthodox, faded away as expressed before, whereas the weak covenantalism still lingers in modern constitutionalism and modern social contract doctrines. Here, Moots asks a question of cardinal importance. Quote, at what point in the, quote, evolution, end quote, of political covenanting does covenanting cease to be recognizable as covenanting, end quote? Elazar conceptualizes the metamorphosis of covenant into contract by arguing that the words covenant and compact were used before modernity to indicate to the agreement between God, king, and people. The covenant was a purely theological concept borrowed from Jewish theology, having strong constitutional implications and made with God, whereas compacts lacked an explicit divine dimension and were more like binding secular oaths. Covenants, along with compacts, actually more than compacts, had public and moral character, and contracts were merely legal pledges between individuals. Therefore, covenants and compacts tend to strengthen moral and communal liberty under divine law, while contract had a tendency to strengthen positivistic and individualistic notions of liberty. However, Moots states that Elars's conceptualization has limited value because there is not a linear shift from covenants to contract, and it is not completely true that covenants had religious and moral dimensions in the past, whereas contracts were of secular nature. According to Moots, this metamorphosis is more complicated. Although it is certain that covenantalism influenced the birth of contractarianism, there is not an exact historical boundary between them, but Elazar's conceptualization helps understand the fact that covenants, at least mostly, had a notion of federal liberty that emphasizes freedom within a divinely determined set of laws, thereby enjoying moral and communal character, while contracts stressed the natural and individualistic character of liberty. I'm just continue to talk about Elazar's narrative and conversion of covenants into compact, and then Moots talks about just another thing. These are authors, Daniel Elazar, and I forgot the other guy's name is Moots, but he wrote a different book that I have. It's called I think it was something like the Anglo Tradition of Political Theology, or something like that, or I think he cites it somewhere. A lot of books here in the notes that are pretty good. You can usually find interesting books in the bibliography. Probably just look for it later, but yeah, I have his book now. It's somewhere. Anyway, but that's what that book is about. And it looked interesting, so I bought it and just put it here. This one's Faith and Order: The Reconciliation of Law and Religion by Harold Berman. I think this is like an 80s book. It looked like an 80s book. Looks like this. There's the Bible and the Hebrew Bible there. And the Christian Bible. Yeah, the Bible and Hebrew scriptures, I think. a lot of highlighting. It's like a used book. There's a lot of chapters. Like its contents, introduction to religious dimensions of law. Part 1 is historical themes. Chapter 2, why the history of Western law is not written. Chapter 3 is the religious foundations of Western law. Chapter 4, medieval English equity. Chapter 5, law and belief in 3 revolutions. Chapter 6, the transformation of Western legal philosophy in Lutheran Germany. Chapter 7, the religious sources of general contract law and historical perspective. Chapter 8, the interaction of law, the religion, and American constitutional history. Chapter 9, religious freedom and the challenge of the modern state. Part 2 is sociological and philosophical themes. Chapter 10, some false premises of Max Weber's sociology of law. Chapter 11, individualistic and communitarian theories of justice and historical approach. Chapter 12, law and religion and development of a world order. Chapter 13, toward an integrative jurisprudence, politics, morality, and history. Then part 3 is theological, prophetic, and educational themes. Chapter 14, law and love. Chapter 15, Judaic-Christian versus pagan scholarship. Chapter 16, law and history after the World Wars. Chapter 17, the crisis of legal education in America. Chapter 18, is there such a thing? Can there be such a thing as a Christian law school? Part 4, Russian and Soviet themes. Chapter 19, atheism and Christianity in Soviet Russia. Chapter 20, the use of law to guide people to virtue, and a comparison of Soviet and U.S. perspectives. Chapter 21, the Wait Here, Masters of the Law, a response to Solzhenitsyn. Chapter 22, Christianity and Democracy in Soviet Russia. In the preface, some of the preface, the danger that faces us today, in contrast with earlier times, is, I believe, not the danger of excessive sanctification of law or excessive legalization of religion. It is not a crisis of their excessive integration, but rather a crisis of their excessive fragmentation. We are threatened more by contempt for law than by worship of it, and more by skepticism regarding the ultimate meaning and purpose of life and of history than by some great all-embracing totalitarian eschatology, emphasis on the dualism of church and state, spiritual and secular, faith and order, religion and law, makes sense as an answer to monistic claims of the total state or of the total church. In the West today, however, we are threatened more by anarchy than by dictatorship, and more by apathy and decadence than by fanaticism. That, at least in my starting point in addressing various aspects of the interrelationship of law and religion, the first chapter of the book is an anthropological introduction which argues that in all societies, law in the broadest sense shares with religion in the broadest sense certain elements, namely ritual, tradition, authority, and universality, elements or values that protect law from degenerating into legalism. This introductory chapter offers definitions of law and religion, which set the stage for a subsequent analysis of very specific aspects of both. In Part 1, historical themes are addressed, including the importance of religious belief and ecclesiastical legal institutions in the formation of the Western legal tradition in the 12th to 15th centuries, the impact of Lutheranism on Western legal philosophy in the 16th century, English Puritan influences on the development of the principle of absolute obligation for breach of contract in the 17th century, and religious sources and implications of the constitutional protection of religious freedom in the United States viewed in a historical perspective. And Part 2, the sociological and philosophical themes are addressed, including the analysis of philosophical fallacies implicit in Max Weber's sociology of law, as well as in contemporary debates between adherents of individualists and communitarian, therefore, the theories of law. the argument that both sociology of law and social theory generally have suffered from a failure to recognize that the religious dimension of law is developed further in the next chapter in the context of the emergence in the latter half of the 20th century, of a new brand of sociology called sociology of the world system. Here both the roles of law and of religion have been addressed, if at all, in negative terms, as obstacles to global unification, whereas the more striking fact is the emergence of a large body of world common law and also of a movement towards rapprochement among the world's great religions. Finally, part 2 closes with a chapter on analyzing the three major schools of the legal philosophy, namely natural law theory, legal positivism, and historical jurisprudence, arguing that it is history that determines whether we emphasize the source of law and morality, natural law theory, or the source of law and politics, positivism. The thesis is advanced that through historical jurisprudence, the truth in natural law theory can be integrated with the truths in positivism. Part 3 addresses theological themes, including biblical concepts of the relation of law to love, as well as differences between, quote, academic and, quote, and Judeo-Christian modes of scholarship and the prophetic tasks of law and religion in the development, for the first time in the history of mankind, of a global economy and global culture. The crisis of American legal education is discussed in this context. Just finally, part 4 addresses problems of religion and law in Russia, chiefly in Soviet Russia, but also to some extent in pre-Soviet and post-Soviet Russia. It is argued that Russian experience has much to teach us concerning the nature of legal systems and the nature of belief systems, as well as the nature of the interaction of the one with the other. A book such as this, whose chapters were written during a period of over 50 years, could not have come into existence without the inspiration, intellectual nourishment, and support of literally hundreds of teachers, colleagues, and students and friends, not to mention the practical assistance of secretaries, librarians, editors, and publishers. Under circumstance, the author may be forgiven for acknowledging the help of only a few who worked assiduously in producing the present edition. It's talking about Nancy Knack and Mary Warren. They typed up the manuscript, and I just basically giving thanks to people who helped them with their book. This first chapter is an introduction, religious dimensions of law. This Western man is undergoing an integrity crisis, the kind of crisis that many individual men and women experience in the early 50s, when they ask themselves with utmost seriousness and often in panic what their lives have stood for and where they are headed. Now we are asking that question not only as individuals but as nations and as groups within nations. Our whole culture seems to be facing the possibility of a kind of nervous breakdown. One major symptom of this threatened breakdown is the massive loss of confidence in law, not only on the part of law consumers but also on the part of lawmakers and law distributors. The second major symptom is the massive loss of confidence in religion. Again, not only in the part of those who, at least at funerals and weddings, sit in the pews of our churches and synagogues, but also on the part of those who occupy the pulpits. Historians tell us that in every generation a complaint is made that people are losing their religious faith and their respect for law. And it may also be true that there are more church-going, law-abiding Europeans and Americans today than there were in previous periods of history, yet the symptoms of an integrity crisis are unmistakable. Among the earliest signs were those given after the First World War by artists and poets and novelists, men like Picasso and Joyce, whose work revealed that traditional conceptions of space and time and even of language itself was disintegrating, cracking up. Then came the intellectual upheavals of the 1930s, and social scientists told us that the traditional social, political, and economic structures had lost their validity. Europe was torn by new revolutionary mythologies, while America withdrew herself. Ironically, the Second World War gave the nations of the West a temporary lift. We found we were, after all, capable of collective action and of potential sacrifice, personal sacrifice, for traditional common goals. This spirit was artificially maintained for a time after the war, especially by the campaign against communism. But since the 1950s, we have increasingly experienced a sense of futility and a premonition of doom, the most visible signs of which are the progressive demoralization of the cities, the deep frustration of a significant portion of the youth, and the incapacity of the nation to act decisively in the interests of peace, either at home or abroad. What makes this an integrity crisis rather than some other kind of crisis is precisely its relation to the loss of confidence in religion and in law. In the centuries prior to World War I, religion and law, especially in America, were the patrimony of our collective life. They embody our sense of common purpose and our sense of social order and social justice. Quote, the style of integrity, and quote, Derrickson words, quote, developed by our civilization, end quote. Our disillusionment with formal religion, with formal law, is thus symptomatic of a deeper loss of confidence in fundamental religious and legal values, a decline of belief in and commitment to any kind of transcendent reality that gives life meaning, and a decline of belief in and commitment to any structures and processes that provide social order, social justice, torn by doubt concerning the reality of those values that sustained us in the past. We come face to face with the prospect of death itself. This is just the introduction, and then I'll read it. I only read like a chapter of it though, but it seemed interesting enough to buy it. But I'll read the rest of it later. And then I want to read this one. This one's, I bought it recently. It's called Virtuous Liberty, a Christian defense of classical liberalism and the free society against cultural leftism and the new right. This is by Andrew Sutherland. It says some pretty interesting things, but I was looking at things like if liberalism or Enlightenment thought contributed positively to Christian order. So I found this book. What are some of the contents? Let me see. Some of the contents. Christianity, mother of political liberty. And I guess this has different. I think they look like essays from different authors. And like the essays compiled together. This one is two liberalisms, two anti-liberalisms. Liberalism takes seriously man created in God's image, and therefore free within God's cosmic order. Some of the chapters in here is culture dependent meaning, modern liberalism, classical liberalism, Protestant liberalism, the right kind, anti-status liberalism, spirits of liberalism, liberalism's liberty, liberalism of the American colonies and the founding, Marxist anti-liberalism, virtuous anti-liberalism, revived integralism, virtue requires liberty, conclusion. The next chapter is classical liberalism and the Bible. When the American founders wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, including principally life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they were simply channeling creational truth. And some of the chapters here is the protection of individual liberty, the impartial rule of law, God's law impartially binds all, the consolidation of political power, the inviolability of private property, and conclusion. In the third chapter, Catholicity, Culture, and American Exceptionalism. An edited and expanded version of a lecture delivered for a number of years at the Blackstone Legal Fellowship for the Alliance Defending Freedom. And some of the chapters is Catholicity, Defending American Exceptionalism, the United States Founding and Christianity, Individual Liberty, Religious Liberty, Separation of Powers, Protection for Minorities, Commerce, Protestant Dynamism, Universal Morality, Religio, Culture, Virtue, American Exceptionalism, and Catholicity, the current internal tension. The next chapter 4 is Post-Liberal is Post-Christian. A Christian state is not a state that imposes Christianity, but one that creates a framework for liberty. The Christian state is the minimal state. This is some of the chapters in this section is Freedom from Freedom to. This is the new anti-liberty conservatives, integralism, illiberalism, the conservative leftist agreement, forever fusionist. Virtue requires liberty, and liberty requires virtue. Liberty is the chief political common good. Conclusion, what a Christian state really means. And then the next chapter 5, classical liberalism and cultural Marxism, anti-liberty from the left. And some of the chapters in here are liberty, classical liberalism, liberation, cultural Marxism, romantic view of human nature, liberation for the sublimated true self, an extended metaphor, Antonio Gramsci, cultural hegemony, cultural transformation, leveling of hierarchies, the periphery-centered society, the uncommon common sense, Herbert Marcuse, repressive tolerance, two kinds of tolerance, two kinds of repression, destabilizing language, pre-censorship, cultural Marxism is Marxist libertarianism, ideological feminism, homosexuality, law, crime, criminals, and the justice system, multiculturalism. That gives you a conclusion. In chapter 6, this is Calvinism as the foundation for liberty. Abraham Kuyper's call for sphere sovereignty. Sphere sovereignty. And some of these chapters are the heart of Calvinism, God's sovereignty. Then sphere of sovereignty, two threats of sphere sovereignty, and our freedom. And the next chapter is Team Liberty. Classical liberalism is not a hindrance to the common good. It is itself a common good. And some of the sections in this chapter is classical liberalism is losing on the right common good, Cooper, and political liberty. And it goes on to the next chapter, chapter 8, seized by a temporary insanity. The funny thing is that both progressives and post-liberals have convinced themselves that the American system gives the other side an unfair advantage. And some sections in this chapter are conservatives against the U.S. founding, conservatives aping progressives, and then the ring of power. And then the next chapter is called Illiberalism for Cultural Losers. Illiberalism is the deep desire to deny to others the rights of conscience and belief and property that we ourselves enjoy, and to force them into conformity to our vision of the common good by way of coercive state power. It's the last resort of losers, cultural losers. Then the next chapter is chapter 10, Economic Liberty and its Enemies. Suppression of freedom and virtue is the outcome we can expect when economic liberty is made expendable. And some of the sections in this chapter is Fusionism, the old debate of the new right, Marxism and the new right, trade-offs versus solutions, what centralized planners cannot know, and it gives you a conclusion. In chapter 11, A Children's Crusade, Stephen Wolfe and the Great Restoration. Stephen Wolfe. I don't know why I thought about that guy from the Justice League. It's Stephen Wolfe, yeah, the enemy, that bad guy. But anyway, it gives you some sections: introduction, preliminary matters, kicking God upstairs, the method to the madness, and then the conclusion. And then it gives you in the other chapter, chapter 12, postmodern as postmodern does. Postmodernism and critical theory and Wolfe's Christian nationalism. And it gives you these different sections. Kevin D. Yeah, this is by Kevin D. Johnson. Yeah, because all these sections are like different essays from different authors. And then some of the sections here are social change by corruption, postmodernity as Christian nationalism, Augustine and Hegel, Protestant revisionism, and conclusion. And in chapter 13, Christianity versus racism. There is, it's quoting about verse, there is no Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female for you, for all are one in Christ Jesus, and if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed. Here is according to the promise. It's Galatians 3:28. This one's by Joseph Booth, and it's in his section of his essay. Some of the sections are the origin of race and racism, ethnicity and people group, the cultural and philosophical context of contemporary racial tension, Marxian inverse racism and Christian culture, primordial nationalism and romanticism, the biblical view of race and nationhood. And in chapter 14, Christians, the public square, and the Ambrose option. Despite its many critics, classical liberalism actually invokes key aspects of, quote, real reality, end quote, as it structures society's political economy. A valorized yet fallen individual imbued with liberty, a limited state, civil society teeming with innovative and meditating institutions, a virtuous market with free trade, all operating within an overarching moral framework. And in this chapter, some of the sections are competence, what's your textual orientation, what's your theological orientation, the Ambrose option. There's a lot of chapters. Chapter 15, put not your trust in princes. The time has come to refresh and reaffirm what markets can and cannot be expected to do in present times. And then this section, it has, and this chapter has different sections. Undermining the free enterprise worldview, specious arguments against the market, what politics cannot do economically, ruled by angels, refresh and reaffirm. And the next chapter, chapter 16, the problem with integralism. The right to religious liberty is neither a moral license to adhere to error nor a supposed right to error, but rather a natural right of the human person to civil liberty, i.e. immunity, within just limits from external constraint in the religious matters by political authorities. Some of the sections here are what is integralism, a pro-liberty response to integralism, Jesus versus Pilate, integralism and the arrested development of political liberty. In chapter 17, the world that would not obey. Certainly people have long been calling the liberal order a failure, but in my view that is largely because they want it to be a failure. It's wish casting, and then goes on to the next chapter. Chapter 18, Christian culture and biblical law. You don't create a Christian society via politics, you create a Christian society via culture. Some of the sections is civil law is minimal, culture precedes law, then conclusion. The next chapter is chapter 19, Church and State, a contemporary case study. There is a growing obsession with purity, right and left, and a desperate desire for some authority or ideology to determine who is in and who is out. And some of the sections are Christians killing Christians, blunting the church's prophetic witness, turning God into a tribal deity, in conclusion. And then chapter 20, Bronze Age pagan masculinity versus Christian masculinity, the secular leftist egalitarianism and the pagan conservative counter-revolution are equally futile attempts at a foothold in quicksand. And then some of the sections is the Bronze Age mindset, the Bronze Age males, modifying Darwin and aping Nietzsche, Bronze Age in politics, the Bronze Age mindset versus Christianity, the Bronze Age mindset, Christians and conservatives. It's called Christian vitalism, end quote, and it follows with a conclusion. And chapter 21, the little revolutionaries, knowing a little history of what actually happens when little revolutionaries, quote, seize power, end quote, to, quote, renew, end quote, national life by way of the, quote, blunt instrument, end quote, of the state, will help you to see them for who they are and to avoid them. In chapter 22, reactionaries and revolutionaries too. If the new right reactionaries get what they want, it won't be what they claim they're restoring. It'll be an amalgam of an idealized conservative past and an actual revolutionary present. And some of the sections in this chapter is what makes for reactionaries, quote, archaeological utopians, end quote, of the right, analysis of reactionaries on the left. It says new neocon as reactionary revolutionaries, and it follows with a conclusion. I read a few of these chapters. This little section is virtue requires liberty. As attractive as this option might seem, it bypasses one vital truth. Virtue requires liberty. The argument against political liberty, classical liberalism, on the grounds that it permits depravity, is equally an argument against God's creation order. God created man with free choice, and therefore the possibility of sin, even egregious sin, just as the risk of man creating him as a moral agent is the possibility of his apostasy, so the risk of a free society is the possibility of social depravity. Free society within the Protestant-based classical liberalism sees liberty itself and the free society as a virtue for a cogent argument. See Frank S. Mayer's In Defense of Freedom. It says liberty is not an end of itself, but in fact one essential component of virtue. Coerced virtue is not virtue. This, as Alfred S. Originary writes, he says, conservatism, modern classical liberalism, is based on the idea that the pursuit of virtue is the purpose of our existence and that liberty is an essential component of the pursuit of virtue. Adherence to virtue is also a necessary condition of the pursuit of freedom. This is why virtuous anti-liberalism is not merely a failure, but also a self-contradiction. The anti-liberal society cannot be the virtuous society because it is not free. Virtue and liberty are both required and never the one without the other. Of course, no society is absolutely free. All societies are required by God to operate within his moral law. State coercion to protect against murder, rape, theft, kidnapping, and other external violations of life, liberty, and property are not merely biblically justified, but required. Classical liberalism is not identical to libertarianism, certainly not as exhibited in Ayn Rand's atheistic, quote, objectivism, end quote, or in the modern Libertarian Party with its full-on surrender to the sexual revolution. However, with proper qualifications, we can speak of, quote, Christian libertarianism, end quote, which I summarized in 1996 as, quote, maximum freedom under God's law, end quote. Within the broad parameters of God's moral law, there must be maximum individual liberty to create and preserve the virtuous society. Revive integralism and other right-wing post-liberalisms, though ill-intentioned, cannot permit this liberty. He gives you this conclusion. It says, classical liberalism isn't only the political philosophy of the U.S. founding. More importantly, and as we will see in the next chapter, it is more closely aligned with the Bible's conception of a social order. The Bible is not a handbook on politics, but its truths create a picture of what a righteous society should look like. We're all created in God's image and personally responsible for our actions. And we may not enlist the coercive state to redress our grievances of being a woman or a Hispanic or a lower middle class citizen. We must recognize that while all of us have confronted hard, unforeseen circumstances, we should take it as a rule that we are today where our own own decisions have brought us. We are not victims. We should have the liberty to decide and live with the consequences of our decisions. Society should conform as nearly as possible in a fallen world to God's righteous law, not imposed by the state, apart from basic moral law protecting life, liberty, and property, but embraced freely by citizens. This is why gospel preaching and biblical instruction in family, church, and schools are imperative. To resurrect liberty, we must work to restore that godly culture. That culture will eventually work its way into politics, not vice versa. There is no more pressing character quality in reviving liberty. The individual responsibility, anti-liberal thinking, stresses group, or identitarian dynamics. Your meaning in life is rooted in your sex, or your race, or your economic status. You are a captive to that identity, and that identity excuses your privations and failures. If you're a woman, quote, the patriarchy, end quote, has held you back. If you're black, quote, white supremacy, end quote, has oppressed you. If you're homosexual, a, quote, heteronormative, end quote, society has prevented the exercise of your full, quote, identity, end quote. Liberalism is the political philosophy that allows us to make and live with our decisions. The state will not save us. It will protect our life, liberty, and property. It will not protect us from our bad decisions, from our sins, from ourselves. Liberalism takes seriously man's created in God's image, and therefore free within God's cosmic order. Man's primal calling is to exercise dominion over the creation within that order. Genesis 1:27-30. No political system has been better than liberalism at providing man the freedom to fulfill that task. The political philosophy of the United States was bequeathed to our founders by our Protestant forefathers, and reviving the championing that philosophy is essential to a righteous society. To resurrect individual responsibility under God's authority is to resurrect liberalism. The next chapter is classical liberalism and the Bible. This is when the American founders wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, including principally life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They were simply channeling creational truths. And it talks about that. But I would agree, though, like, the culture is very important. That is not, like, a battlefield that you want to neglect as Christians, right? Like, some Christians, you'd be surprised that they are against spreading the kingdom of God through the culture. And they say retarded things. The kingdom of God is not of this world. But it's like, all throughout the Bible, you do see them spreading the kingdom, its principles, manifesting its powers, right? The miracles and things like that. And so it's just really dangerous to not have a culture that is influenced by the kingdom of God, right? I mean, you know that this is where all these like cultural Marxists and woke people are fighting all the battles in the culture, and there is no Christian there to stand in that gap. And that's why it's dangerous to listen to Christians who tell you not to be politically involved, and yet they complain about abortion and all of these things, how ungodly America is, but they themselves are not participating in the battles that need to be fought, right? And so, yeah, the culture should be influenced by the kingdom of God. That which is not of this world has to influence this world. You know, it's not the other way around, where because it's not of this world, you should not therefore proclaim it, because it's not of this world, right? And it's absurd. It's totally antichrist to be like that, to have that kind of mentality as a Christian. That you're not going to influence the culture with the kingdom of God because the kingdom of God is not of this world. It's not of this world, right? It's retarded. It's retarded mentality. This is why you have a culture of antichrist. Because you don't fight those kinds of battles, and it's retarded. So yeah, the Christian is needed in the culture. Without Protestant authoritarianism or whatever, or Christian authoritarianism of any kind. And yeah, enforcing constitutional morality is not authoritarianism. Like, even liberals do that. I would agree with that. Like, okay, and then this one is a Protestant Christendom, the world the Reformation made. Edited by Onsi A. Kamel. Looks like this. It says, our world is obsessed with stories about Protestantism and modernity. Our Protestant society is dynamic, progressive, and free, or godless, Erastian, and libertine. People once rejoiced in Protestantism's creation of societies grounded on reason, freedom, and the individual. Now many pin the blame for modernity's ills squarely on the Reformation, but both perspectives have a shared assumption that Protestantism necessitates revolution and the dissolution of religious and metaphysical bonds which once united generations, nations, and a continent, the church, and even heaven and earth. But what if these accounts are wrong? What if Protestantism is something more or different altogether? The burden of this book is to illumine Protestantism's historic vision of society, culture, and governance, applying its rich legacy to our own day, collecting and expanding essays originally published in the journal Ad Fontes. This book deals with the issues of church and state, politics and culture, and economics and justice, proposing that Protestantism's own vision for these things is worth seeing afresh on its own terms. Says, if you are willing to ask, quote, a Protestant Christendom, end quote, you may be surprised by the answer. I don't know, this one is like contributor has a list of contributors. I think it's like different people wrote different essays, right? Yeah, this is like the other book. It has different essays of different people, I think. Like maybe different contributors. And some of the contents in this book. Here's part 1, Church and State. The Freedom of a Christian Nation. This is from Bradford Littlejohn. I think I see some of his YouTube videos online. And then part 2, Inhabiting the Places of Promise. Martin Luther's teaching on the 3 institutions. Michael Latham. And then, quote, Nursing Fathers. The Magistrate and the Moral Law. This is E.J. Hutchinson. The Promise and Pearl of Disestablishment, Baptist and Reformed Political Theology in the New Republic. It's from Miles Smith, 4th. James Wilson's America's Natural Law Architect. This is by Ethan Foster. And part 2, Politics and Culture. This is Neglected Craft, Prudence and Reformed Political Thought by Adam Carrington. The next one is The Art of Protestant Learning by Roberta Bayer. And the last one in this section is Retrieving John Donne, Poetic Companion for Conflicted Protestants, from Rise Laverty. In part 3, the next part is Economics and Justice. This is Against the Infinite Stimulus of Greed, Martin Bucer's Reformation of Welfare. This is by Bradford Littlejohn. Next one is What is Work For? By Joseph Minnick. Martin Luther and Tax, A Protestant Perspective on Retributive Taxation. This is by Alan Calhoun. And Who's Afraid of Social Justice? By Brian Dijkema. And the last one is Why We Need the Common Good by Jake Medor. Introduction. What does it say? It says Protestantism made the modern world, or so say the polemicists. Over the last several centuries, debates between and about Catholics and Protestants have shifted, and we no longer argue for the veracity or superiority of this or that position so much as we seek to defend our respective traditions based on their societal and political fruits. Are Protestant societies dynamic, progressive, and free or godless, Aristian and libertine? Are Catholic societies enchanted, traditional, and morally serious, or superstitious, stultifying, and backwards? Older generations of theologians and historians argued that Protestantism created societies grounded on reason, freedom, and the individual. The 19th century Reformed theologian and patristic scholar Philip Schaff argued that although Protestantism produced, quote, false and hateful, end quote, rationalism, it also produced those elements of rationalism which, quote, served to overthrow many false prejudices and made many contributions of permanent worth to history and criticism, end quote. Furthermore, Schaff argued the Roman Church, does not, sufficiently respect the world and its own divine rights, and seeks to subject it to herself in a violent, unnatural, and premature way, By contrast, the world since the 16th century has reached a measure of cultivation such as it never possessed before. The Protestant states are incomparably superior to Catholic states, shows altogether more more order, obedience, and contentment. Protestantism's distinctive achievement, culturally and politically speaking, was the escape from bondage to papal subjugation. Protestantism cast off papal superstition, a precondition for the genesis of the modern world. Thus, Schaff draws clear causal connections from Protestantism to reason, freedom, and prosperity and advance. A more recent crop of genealogists, including Alasdair MacIntyre, Brad Gregory, and Charles Taylor, also look upon Protestantism as the begetter of the distinctive characteristics of, modernity, although they associate modernity with a different regime, having ambivalent connotations. Secularity for them, Protestantism still stands in a causal relationship to modernity, but modernity is no longer considered an unambiguous good. Brad Gregory argues that, scientific naturalism is deeply beholden to metaphysical univocity, and metaphysical univocity spread in part because the Reformation rejected the notion that, the transcendent God manifests in and through the material world, Protestantism begets metaphysical revolution. MacIntyre, for this part, contrasts the, moral shame, of the European Middle Ages, Aristotelian and teleological natural law with Protestantism's, new conception of reason, holding fallen reason, can supply no genuine comprehension of man's end, On this telling, Protestant theology upholds a noetic fall, and a noetic fall destroys theological ethics. Protestantism begets ethical revolution. The account provided by Charles Taylor of the relationship between Protestantism and modernity is the most sophisticated of the three, and worth discussing at length. Taylor focuses upon the, move to disenchantment, In short, the fulfillment of human life and all of life was once believed to exist outside the scope of purely human possibilities, whereas now it is possible to place it, within human life, In the enchanted world of pre-modernity, meaning was outside of us and operated on us. The world was filled with, forces, and objects that had powers. Demons, saints, relics, the host, and the blessed or cursed objects. Powers and forces possess objective meaning, and they impose this meaning upon humans. The fact that power and meaning resided both inside and outside of people, and the fact that both internal and external meanings and powers could condition people, rendered humans, porous, There was no hard boundary between my mind and the external world, including my body. Sorry. By contrast, with modernity, arises the, buffered, self, which allows us to, disengage everything outside the mind, to consign it to an external world which has no fixed meaning or essential significance. What does this have to do with secular modernity? Taylor makes a number of arguments, but one is critical for this book. When the self is porous and subject to powers, out there, the community has a vested interest in guarding against such powers. And so public religious observance becomes a matter of survival. The buffer itself, however, makes this essential. There are no spiritually charged realities to guard against. When the world is enchanted and humans are vulnerable, they develop a, good magic, Historically, the church's magic, consisting of sacraments, sacramentals, relics, and the like, to counteract the, bad, The various reform movements culminating in the Protestant Reformation produced the buffered self and attempted to overthrow this magical system. The community no longer needed to guard against bad enchantments, which means it no longer needed to orient itself around God and the church. Protestantism begets cultural and political revolution. The claim that Protestantism begets political revolution has been developed in a number of ways. Perhaps Protestantism, particularly in the American Revolution, secularized and thus paradoxically sacralized the state. Perhaps Protestantism subjected the church to the state, forfeiting the church's independence. Perhaps Protestantism views church and state by idealizing a Christian commonwealth, and so on. The particulars are of little importance, but one line runs through all of these accounts: the association of Protestantism with revolution, with the severing of religious and metaphysical bonds which united diverse European nations, bound individuals to the religion of their community, joined past and present, connected heaven and earth. What if these accounts fundamentally misunderstood not only the Reformation but the character of modernity itself? This is John A. Jacobson Storm has contested the very notion of a coherent, quote, modernity, end quote, or, quote, disenchantment, end quote, altogether. According to Josephson Storm, modernity does not describe an event or era. Modernity is a dual sign, first as evidenced by historians' inability to settle on a relative dating for the modern period. It does not describe a set of intellectual tendencies or material developments, but merely signifies rupture with the past. Modernity is not pre-modernity. Second, it is a special signifier, quote, to call a culture modern is to ally it with newness and to consign its opposite to colonization or the scrap heap of history, end quote. In short, modernity is not a descriptor but a sign in service of a project, the project of realizing modernity. Josephson Storm argues that not only is modernity a suspect category, but it has not even, quote, experienced disenchantment or a loss of myth, end quote. Altogether, although secularism is often presented as a kind of Protestantism, and Protestantism is construed as anti-magic, magic was never eclipsed. To see this, we need only to ask what, quote, magic, end quote, means. As Joseph Storm argues, the categories, quote, religion, end quote, and, quote, science, end quote, were constructed as opponents, and this opposition generated a third category, superstition, negatively construed, or magic, quote, or magic positively construed. Protestantism as a modernizing phenomenon becomes the mechanism of science's triumph over religion and superstition. The simple problem with this picture is that magic was never defeated. Neither science nor religion managed to vanquish it. Even as scholars theorize that Protestantism generated the science that killed it, the very theorists of disenchantment were in many cases enamored with the occult, patronizing mediums, hearing spirits, doing magic, and substantial majorities of people today continue to be so enamored. In light of this, we must ask if it is the case that accounts of Protestantism's relationship to modernity are fundamentally wrong-headed. How should we understand Protestantism? Put another way, if Protestantism's culture and social import must be described in terms but do not simply attribute to it whatever our society has become, and what terms should we seek to understand it? Can we move beyond narratives of Protestant disjuncture and church-state dysfunction, investigating Protestantism's political culture and social vision on its own terms? The burden of this book is to illuminate this vision, and always with an eye toward applying it to our own day. The book is divided into three main parts: church and state, politics and culture, and economics and justice. Together, the authors in each section have written essays giving an overview of the classical Protestant position, as well as drawing our contemporary implications of that position. We begin at the Reformation, but we do not end there. What becomes immediately apparent in the first section of the book concerning church and state is this: classical Protestantism rejects the secular nation. As Calvin observed, not even pagans denied their civic obligations to their gods, and almost all Protestants' confessions assert, in the words of the Westminster Confession of Faith, the principle that the magistrate, quote, hath authority, and it is his duty to take order that unity and peace be preserved in the church, that all blasphemies and heresies be suppressed, all corporations and abuses in worship and discipline prevented or reformed, end quote. The Reformers did not reject the claim that society should be ordered to God, and like their, quote, superstitions, end quote, or, quote, magical, end quote, Roman Catholic counterparts, they believed that this ordering was of the utmost importance. Crucially, however, Protestants did not claim that this ordering entails the subordination of earthly magistrates to the church militant. Luther and his hearers foregrounded the fact that the churches of the world, word and sacraments are spiritual realities, The Church's exercise of jurisdiction is not. Thus, when the Church passes judgment on temporal affairs, she acts as just one more temporal power. What follows from this, if the Church's actions in this world is worldly, then the demand of that magistrates submit their judgment to her is an attempt usurpation of the authority given them by God. Thus, Brad Littlejohn's opening essay, quote, "The Freedom of the Christian Nation," quote, details the late medieval and Protestant political tradition which asserted the supremacy of the nation and the ordering of its ecclesial and political affairs. And in the second chapter, quote, "Inhabiting the Places of Promise," quote, Michael Laffin expounds Luther's doctrine of the three estates. Each of the three estates, the civil magistrates, the church, and the family, possess its own integrity and independence because each is created by God for human flourishing. The Reformers' chief political aim was not secularizing the nation, but rather thwarting the papacy's attempt to usurp the magistrate's authority and become a pseudo-spiritual imperial superpower. In short, Protestants sought to re-establish the Constantinian ecclesial order. Relatedly, for the Reformers, the magistrate's authority was not limited to executing justice in a narrow sense, as when early modern Roman Catholic ecclesiastical courts convicted men of heresy, only to deliver them to the king for burning. Rather, the magistrate's authority extends to all matters of justice as set forth in the natural law and the Ten Commandments. It includes the sword, but extends beyond it to the regulation of the Church's temporal life, as seen in both the Old Testament and the Constantinian imperial order. E.J. Hutchinson's chapter, Nursing Fathers, goes into greater detail about how the Reformers envisioned the magistrates upholding religion, and in the process, he is careful to point out that all important distinctions between classical Protestant political theology and Roman Catholic imperialism on this score. Protestant doctrine would, however, eventually develop its understanding of the magistrate's authority with regard to the Church, creating space for a Protestantism without state churches, thus with Miles Smith's The Force and Ethan Foster's contribution, respectively, quote, "The Promise and Pearl of Disestablishment," quote, and, quote, James Wilson, quote, "We move squarely to North America, particularly the colonial and early post-revolutionary periods. Each essay charts distinctive American contributions to and departures from this classical Protestant inheritance. Smith by detailing how Baptists allied with deists to overturn religious establishment, and Foster by outlining the contours of founding father James Wilson's synthesis of democratic liberalism and the natural law tradition. The second section investigates Protestants' politics and culture, demonstrating how deeply it was in debt to the Renaissance ideals of learnedness and skill in humane letters. Adam Carrington's, quote, "The Neglected Craft," quote, shows how highly the Reformers prized wisdom and in particular prudence in applying laws. This may be one of the book's most important contributions for us today. In an era when the right and the left are motivated by ideologies and theories of progress, of free markets, of bodily autonomy, Carrington draws out the indispensability of a wise ruler's non-ideological application of laws in the messiness of human life. But how is such wisdom produced? Roberta Bayer, quote, "The art of Protestant learning," quote, illumines the kind of education and formation the Reformers hoped children would receive, and they might grow into virtuous adults while Rye's Liberty, quote, "Retreating John Donne," quote, reflects on the fruits of each education, on the peerless poet John Donne, detailing Donne's conversion from Roman Catholicism into the Church of England. Finally, after unpacking Protestant conceptions of the relationship between church and state and elements of the Protestant ideals of politics and culture, we turn squarely to topics with, perhaps surprisingly, as much relevance then as now. Economics and justice. Today, as during the Reformation, seismic shifts in the structure of the economy meant that new problems were arising at a rapid clip, and it was imperative to offer new solutions. The Reformation saw the rise of the merchant class. We have seen the hollowing out of the middle class. The Reformation saw the enclosure of the commons. We have seen public goods and institutions such as public universities get further out of reach. The Reformation saw the creation of new kinds of poverty. We have seen poverty's ability to remain stubbornly present in the midst of unimaginable bounty. Even where the reformers' solutions were wrong, they are invaluable aids as we seek to take seriously our own problems. This is Brad Littlejohn against the infinite stimulus of greed. Opens this section with an essay on Boosser's proposals for poor relief, which is welfare, illuminating various principles for us to keep in mind as we seek to ameliorate poverty in our own day. Connected to poverty, of course, is the question of labor, and Joseph Minnick, quote, "What is work for?" end quote, looks to Scripture to seek to discern labor's purpose, and thus, by implication, to answer the question, quote, "How then should we work?" end quote. Alan Calhoun, quote, "Martin Luther on tax," end quote, applies his expertise in tax law and Luther theology to propose a distinctly Protestant theory of taxation in dialogue with Catholic social teaching and prominent secular theories of taxation. Rounding out this volume are two discussions thoroughly rooted in the present. Brian Giacome's reflections on social justice, quote, "Who's afraid of social justice?" end quote, and Jake Medor's full-throated defense of the necessity of a shared common good, quote, "Why we need the common good," end quote. Each of these essays brings out of the distinctive and yet simultaneously Catholic character of Protestant political, social, and cultural thought. To understand Protestantism as it was and as it can be, we must put out of our minds many popular arguments tying Protestantism to, quote, "modernity," end quote, or, quote, "secularity," end quote, whether adulatory or condemnatory. Those in vogue have been tried and found wanting. This is not to say that Protestantism bears no relationship to modernity, but its influences are rather more subtle and certainly less straightforward than cheerleaders or detractors would like to believe. This is all to the good. Once we forget what we thought we knew about Protestantism, we can learn to let it speak to us anew. Perhaps the voices of our forefathers can still challenge and surprise us. Perhaps Protestant Christendom has not yet run its course. So that's what this book's about. So I bought it. It's obviously very interesting. This one looked interesting as well as this one is The System of Liberty, Themes in the History of Classical Liberalism by George Smith. It has this one. The cover looks like that. And then some of its contents. It starts off with an introduction. This is first chapter is Liberalism, Old and New. The second chapter is Liberalism and the Public Good. 3. Liberal Ideology and Political Philosophy. 4. Sovereign State, Sovereign Self. 5. The Anarchy Game. 6. The Chapter Edge of Liberalism. 7. The Idea of Freedom. 8. Conflicts in Classical Liberalism. 9. Individualism. 10. Methodological Individualism. It's just liberal individualism, or, quote, classical liberalism, end quote, as it is often called, has a long and rich ancestry, but it did not begin to take shape as a coherent and integrated political theory until the 17th century. It was in this century that challenges to the theory of political absolutism came to fruition, and the writings of the Levelers, Algernon Sidney, John Locke, and other individualists against the theory of the state sovereignty, which had gained tradition with the rise of the modern nation-state. Liberalism countered with a theory of self-sovereignty, although to which all moral rights and duties ultimately reside in individuals can be delegated to governments only with the consent of the governed. This book is not a history of classical liberalism per se, rather it covers some basic themes and controversies that run throughout the history of liberalism, especially those that divided liberals into different camps, such as natural rights versus utilitarian liberalism. Such internecine conflicts seem to go with the territorial political movements that enjoy some measure of success after a common foe has been vanquished, as was largely the case with political absolutism by the mid-18th century, and the victors tend to turn their gaze inward toward the fundamental premises of their own philosophy in an effort to develop that philosophy in a systematic fashion, and with sustained reflections on how liberal principles can best deal with the problems of political philosophy, came differences of opinion about the foundation of and proper application of those principles. And this next book is Liberalism Without Illusions, Renewing an American Christian Tradition by Christopher Evans. Like this. This is the back. It says, by the 1930s, most mainline Protestant traditions promulgated the key tenets of liberalism, especially in the embrace of modern intellectual theory, along with theological and religious pluralism. In Liberalism Without Illusions, Christopher Evans critiques his own tradition, focusing in particular on why so many Americans today want to distance themselves from this rich and vibrant heritage. In a time when attitudes about, quote, liberal, and quote, versus, quote, conservative, and quote, theology have become the focus of the culture wars, he provides a constructive discussion of how liberalism might move forward into the 21st century, which he argues is indispensable to the future of American Christianity itself. So, and this one is The Theology of Liberalism, Political Philosophy, and the Justice of God by Eric Nelson. Just like that. He says, we think of modern liberalism as a novel product of a world reinvented on a secular basis after 1945. In the Theology of Liberalism, one of the country's most important political theorists argues that we could hardly be more wrong. Eric Nelson contends that the tradition of liberal political philosophy founded by John Rawls is, however, unwittingly the product of ancient theological debates about justice and evil. Once we understand this, he suggests the way we can recognize the deep incoherence of various forms of liberal political philosophy that have emerged in Rawls' wake. Nelson starts by noting that today's liberal political philosophers treat the unequal distribution of social and natural advantages as morally arbitrary. This arbitrariness, they claim, diminishes our moral responsibility for our actions. Some even argue that we cannot morally responsible. Some even argue that we are not morally responsible when our own choices and efforts produce inequalities. In defending such views, Nelson writes, modern liberals have implicitly taken up positions in an age-old debate about whether the nature of the created world is consistent with the justice of God. Strikingly, their commitments diverge sharply from those of their proto-liberal predecessors, who rejected the notion of moral arbitrariness in favor of what was called Pelagianism, the view that beings created and judged by a just God must be capable of freedom and merit. Nelson reconstructs this earlier, quote, liberal, unquote, position and shows that Rawls' philosophy derived from his self-conscious repudiation of Pelagianism. In closing, Nelson sketches a way out of the argumentative maze for liberals who wish to emerge with commitments to freedom and equality intact. Some of the contents in this book, and the first one is Pelagian Origins. The second chapter is Representation and the Fall. The third chapter is, quote, the bargain basis, in quote, Rawls, anti-Pelagianism and moral arbitrariness. 4, egalitarianism and idiocy. 5, justice, equality, and institutions. And 6 is the final chapter. Is, quote, God gave the world to Adam and his posterity in common, end quote, appropriation and the left libertarian challenge. This book's like 160 pages or so long, so it's not really a thick book or something. But I like the topic, so I bought it. This other book is The Idea of Natural Rights by Brian Tierney. Looks like that. Has the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. I think it's the same as the other book that I showed. There's a lot of chapters, like, let me see. Like 13. Let's read some of the introduction. Modern problems and historical approaches. It says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. But of course, Jefferson's self-evident truths about inalienable rights have not seemed evident to most of the human race. Over most of recorded history, all civilized societies have cherished ideals of justice and right order, but they have not normally expressed those ideals in terms of individual natural rights. It would be hard, for instance, to imagine a Confucian, Hobbes, or Locke. Moses gave commandments to the children of Israel, not a code of rights. Plato and Aristotle saw no need to appeal to a concept of natural rights in formulating their political theories. Roman lawyers, too, were able to do without such rights in crafting their complex legal systems. In considering the origin of natural rights theories, we are faced with a historical problem, not a sort of revealed truth. When we address the problem of origins, we need to also bear in mind some of the broader issues concerning human rights in the modern world. Questions like these arise with the classical rights theorists of early modern Europe, nearly articulating a doctrine that was implicit, if unacknowledged, in all societies. Or is the whole idea of human rights peculiarly a product of Western culture? And if the idea did have a distinctly Western origin, can it have any relevance for other peoples? Modern historians, philosophers, and political scientists disagree about such matters. A UNESCO document of 1949 referred to, quote, the antiquity and broad acceptance of the conception of the rights of man, quote, and suggested that the discussion of such rights goes back to the beginnings of philosophy. In both East and West, a few historians would agree with such a broad judgment. Among contemporary philosophers, Alan Guerwef has argued that all humans, simply as conscious agents, must logically claim certain rights for themselves and recognize the same rights in others, specifically rights to freedom and well-being. Guerwef also maintains that rights could exist in all societies even when there is no, quote, clear or explicit recognition and elucidation, end quote, the concept of a right. As the other extreme, Alistair McIntyre criticizes Guerwef's arguments from the standpoint of Aristotelian moral philosophy, dismissed natural rights as mere, quote, fictitious, end quote, an unfortunate invention of modern liberal individualism that we should do well to discard. Arguing from yet another point of view, as a political scientist, Jack Donnelly acknowledges that the doctrine of natural rights had a distinctively Western origin in the, quote, bourgeois revolution, end quote, or the 17th and 18th centuries, but still maintains that the theory so engendered has a universality that makes it generally applicable to all present-day societies. The diversity of these opinions suggests that a historical account of the evolution of natural rights theories might contribute something to the modern debates. Historical inquiry cannot solve all of the problems of modern philosophers and political theorists, but it might help us to address them in a more informed and sophisticated fashion. Donnelly's argument, based on a belief in the innate dignity of human persons, is humane and sensible, but it could be grounded more securely on a different kind of historical analysis. McIntyre has deplored, quote, the deep lack of historical consciousness, end quote, that infects much of modern moral philosophy, but he does not understand the history of the rights theories that he criticizes. Guerwef's philosophical argument is sophisticated and appealing, but it leaves open all the questions that most concern a historian. When did the idea of natural rights find, quote, explicit recognition and elucidation, end quote? What historical context made such a development possible? How did the idea come to survive once it had grown into existence? But when we turn to the historians for enlightenment, there is again no consensus. Kind of Menegu has asserted that the idea of human rights is, quote, as modern as the internal combustion engine, end quote. Donnelly's found a starting point in Locke. An Italian writer has observed with serene confidence that scholars agree unanimously on this one point. Quote, the theory of natural rights is born with Hobbes, end quote. Nad Hackinson discussed the role of Grotius as an innovator. Richard Tuck emphasized the contribution of Gerson. Michael Delay has maintained in a long series of publications that the true, quote, father of subjective rights, end quote, was 14th century Franciscan philosopher William of Ockham. Evidently, there is room for some further historical clarification. The historian's problem does not consist simply in determining when an idea of natural rights as such emerged. There are many ancillary issues, still matters of current debate, that call for further historical investigation. One such issue concerns the scope of natural rights, assuming that they exist at all, especially as regards, quote, active rights, end quote, and, quote, passive rights, end quote. All meaningful assertions of rights make claims on other people, but the claims cannot be of very different kinds. To assert an active right, a right actually to do something, to dig in my own garden, for instance, or to worship as I please, I need demand only forbearance from others. The assertion of a passive right, sometimes called a right of recipients or welfare right, requires that others render to me some good or service, free medical care, perhaps. Some modern scholars argue that the multiplication of social and economic rights, or so-called rights, introduces an, quote, artificial inflation, end quote, into rights language that finally renders the whole concept of human rights vague and valueless. Defenders of welfare rights insist that such rights are at least as essential to human well-being as a mere right to be left alone to pursue one's own interests. On the level of historical discourse, Maurice Cranston argued that rights of recipients are a recent innovation, unknown to the classical theorists of the 17th and 18th centuries. But James Tully found a, quote, right to charity, end quote, in Locke and early in Aquinas. Then Richard Tuck, at the opposite pole from Cranston, argued that a doctrine of passive rights existed in medieval jurisprudence before the idea of actual rights was articulated. His argument does not, however, seem conclusive. The historical issue remains unresolved. The argument about active rights and passive rights grows out of a deeper disagreement concerning the proper relationship between individual and community in a well-ordered society. Modern libertarians fear the encroachment of state power on the core of the individual autonomy that they see as essential for a fully human life. Communitarian critics of rights claims that often discern in them an atomic individualism insensitive to any concept of the common good. Among historians, rights theories are often seen as an individualistic reaction against a medieval communal ethic. Treves, for instance, discussing the thought of the 17th century, wrote, quote, the new value is that of the individual, end quote. Yet Tully has argued that even such a classic rights theorist as Locke did not treat humans as isolated individuals, but always as members of a unified community. Some of the earlier reflections on this theme are discussed in the following chapters. Yet another area of current disagreement concerns the relationship between modern right theories and the more ancient doctrines of natural law and, quote, classical natural right, end quote. Some scholars see natural rights as essentially extrapolations from principles always inherent in the natural law tradition. This was the position of Jacques Martian and more recently of John Finnis. Others, especially Neil Thomas like Villay in Europe and the followers of Leo Strauss in America, vehemently denied any such association between the two areas of thought. Writers of this latter group see modern right theories as radically destructive of the earlier tradition. They maintain that after Ockham or Hobbes or whoever is the chosen innovator, rights came to form the real basis of moral discourse, and natural law was seen as merely derivative, just as some of individual rights. Another approach that we encounter in medieval sources and that might help to explain some early modern texts suggests that natural rights and natural law are not derived from are not derived one from the other, but that both are derived as correlative doctrines from the same underlying view of human personality and this way of thinking. It was assumed that natural law left to individuals a sphere of autonomy where the rights inherent in human nature could licitly be exercised. So since this will be a recurring theme in the following work, and since a derivation of natural rights from human nature may suggest some obvious difficulties to a modern political theorist, it would perhaps be helpful to mention some of these issues on the outset and to indicate briefly why they did not arise in the same way for medieval thinkers. Most obviously, many philosophers nowadays would deny that there is any such thing as a common or universal human nature, quote, in essence, that precedes and antedates history, quote. I should explain, therefore, that in referring to human nature, here and in subsequent discussions, I am not attributing to the authors concerned any doctrine about some abstract, quote, essence, end quote, supposed to inherit in all humans or in any particular theory of universals. Medieval rights theories were not typically derived from such metaphysical considerations. Indeed, in the course of medieval thought, basically similar ideas about natural rights were propounded by philosophers, Thomists, Scotists, and alchemists, who held very different views on universals and essences, and in the post-medieval world, doctrines of rights continued to be asserted by writers who had rejected the whole framework of scholastic thought. The medieval jurists in whose works the doctrine of natural rights first grew into existence did not speculate about essences at all. It was thought for them, as for Locke in a later age, to perceive that humans displayed certain relevant characteristics, the most important ones in this context being rationality and free will. Another evident problem for historians is that if natural rights are inherent in human beings as such, they must always have existed, and this seems contradicted by the lack of such rights in many societies throughout the course of history. But the idea of natural rights is a moral one. It does not refer to the rights that people can actually exercise in any given society, but to rights that ought to be recognized in all societies because they are necessary for the fulfillment of some basic human needs and purposes. This may seem only to lead on to another difficulty. I am thinking now of Hume's familiar argument that we cannot deprive moral statements from factual ones. How then can we derive moral propositions about natural rights by reflecting on the facets of human nature? Hume's argument seems persuasive if we apply it only to external nature. Probably we cannot deduce moral principles from studying the behavior of stones and stars and waterfalls, but medieval rights theories typically did not start out from cosmic nature, and when medieval thinkers reflected on the nature of human beings, one fact they perceived or thought they perceived was that human rationality included a capacity for moral discernment, and from this fact it followed for them that humans ought to do what they discern to be right. Evidently, this would not satisfy a modern Humean critic. And of course, medieval writers did not provide an answer to Hume's argument, but this was because it did not arise for them. Their way of thinking eluded it. So although Hume's problems do not directly concern medieval authors, I have mentioned it here because it does have a relevance for a historian of medieval thought. The argument about moral statements and factual ones is often roughly paraphrased as, quote, you can't get an ought from an is, end quote. Philosophers have worried endlessly about the validity of this proposition, but historians face a different kind of problem. We start out from an awareness that there is an, quote, end quote, standing behind every, quote, ought, end quote. Our task is to understand the, quote, isness, end quote, within which certain kinds of, quote, oughtness, end quote, can be expected to flourish. That is to say, we are concerned to identify the historical context within which certain moral values will be cherished and certain related ideas, like the ideas of natural rights, will seem appealing. I do not mean that all morality is relative, only that moral thought does not exist in a vacuum. In any given historical situation, we can expect to find some moral doctrines emphasized, while others go unrecognized or neglected. The story of natural rights must therefore be in part a story of the environments within which such a concept could take root and flourish. And to make the story intelligible, we need especially to remember that a historical environment is not constituted only by a play of contingent events at some particular time and place, but also by the whole tradition of thought and language that a society inherits from its past. The studies that follow attempt to explore the early tradition of natural rights thinking from which the doctrines of the modern world are ultimately derived. They are presented as ventures into terrain that has not been very thoroughly explored in recent scholarship. We have a huge body of work on present-day rights concepts. One author recently referred to a, quote, Walterian quote of such theories. There also exists an abundant literature on the classical rights doctrines of the 17th century. Indeed, it is hard to keep up with the output of the Hobbes and Locke industry alone from year to year, but compared with the flood of work, there has been only a thin trickle of writing on the idea of natural rights in the postmodern era. The field has not been entirely neglected, of course, as scholars like Michael Villet and Richard Tugg have made important contributions to the discussion of medieval rights theories, but it seems to me, for reasons that will be considered later, that the arguments they have presented are not altogether adequate or satisfying. Some of the chapters below were originally published as separate articles, and others were at first conceived of in the same way. The long section of the Franciscan poverty dispute was planned as a group of separate essays, to which I added a summarizing postscript. The published articles have been unwritten so as to eliminate some of the repetition that inevitably occurs when an author returns to the same theme again and again, and I hope that the reader will excuse such overlapping as remains. In any case, it will be evident that these sections of the book were originally composed as freestanding essays, and particularly the argument in several chapters moves from medieval ideas to early modern ones, and sometimes a contemporary rights discourse. It would be more chronologically tidy, I suppose, if all the modern material were presented at the end of the book. But in writing in the separate articles, I wanted to illustrate the variety of medical and medieval source materials that we need to consider in order to understand adequately the origins of modern rights theories. I also wanted to show that in medieval thought there existed not just some vague idea of a natural right, but many of the specific themes that we encounter in modern works on rights. A distinction between natural rights and positive rights, rights considered as protected choices and as protected interests, active rights and passive rights, alienable natural rights and inalienable natural rights, advantageous rights, rights that were also duties. Medieval thinkers did not categorize all these different kinds of rights, argue about their relative value, and then choose some particular class of rights to emphasize as most essential in the manner of many modern rights theories. But modern rights theories argue in the way they do only because the concepts they discuss were already present and so available to them in the tradition of discourse that the modern world inherited. So in often calling attention to parallels between medieval and modern ideas, I was not intending just to make facile comparisons. I was hoping to make the whole tradition of thought more intelligible. The political culture of the 17th century was evidently different from that of the 13th, but we cannot understand just how it was different or how it became different unless we first learn to know what the early modern world inherited or reappropriated from the preceding medieval era. We shall not fully understand how a culture of rights grew up in Western society until students of modern rights theories are willing to engage seriously with the considerable body of material that is being made available belatedly, perhaps by medievalists. This goes on. This is among modern scholars probably the most widely accepted account of the origin of natural rights theories is the one presented by Michael Villet. He saw the postmodernity of subjective rights as a revolutionary innovation inspired by the nominalist and voluntarist philosophy of William of Ockham. My book begins therefore with a critical study of Villets' thesis. The discussion then moves to the canonistic jurisprudence of the late 12th century. Here I argue that we can find an important shift of language in new understanding of the old term, ius naturale, as meaning a kind of subjective power or ability inhering in individuals, along with an influential doctrine of permissive natural law. The availability of this language, it is suggested, facilitated the growth of a new theory of natural rights altogether. The all natural law teaching the assimilation of the jurist ideas into medieval philosophy and their further development there. It's first illustrated from the work of Henry Mafgant, who wrote, interestingly, on the theme that every individual has a property right in his own person. The essay on the Franciscan poverty dispute is to reconsider the work of William of Ockham in the context of the varied literature evoked by the controversy. Ockham is presented in my work as an important figure in the development of natural rights theories, but argue that his characteristic teachings were not derived from his nominalist and voluntarist philosophy, but rather from a rationalist ethic applied to a body of juristic doctrines available to him in the canon law collections that he knew well and frequently cited. A chapter on Gerson treats the French theologian within the context of the conciliar movement from church reform. It discusses the coexistence in his work of an active concern for individual rights with a profound sense of the church as a mystical body, a holistic corporate community. The next part of the book deals with the late medieval scholastic thought, where, for a time, the idea of natural rights seemed to be losing its relevance to the real-life problems of the age, and I turned to the impact of the European encounter with America on the growth of natural rights theories. This chapter is also concerned with the fusion of Thomism philosophy and juristic thought in the works of the 16th century Spanish scholastics. Their writings represent the final phase of the medieval tradition of thought concerning natural rights and the relationship between individual and community that Grotius inherited and passed on to the modern world. Especially in the latter chapters, the argument of this book is concerned both with the formalistic problems of how the term ius natural came to be understood as meaning a natural right, and with the paradigmatic rights to liberty, property, and resistance to tyranny that became central to the Western rights tradition. I hope that my chapters present an accurate account of the principal stages in the growth of medieval natural rights theories, but I know that they do not exhaust all of the available material. There is room for further research in several areas. We needed, for instance, more work on the concept of rights in English common law and the medieval glossators of Roman law, and in the late medieval jurists, both civilian and canonist. These latter writings often provide the immediate sources through which early modern authors had access to early medieval teachings. Apart from the studies on Aquinas and Ockham, there have been relatively little work on the idea of rights in the writings of medieval philosophers and theologians. Also, many 16th century Spanish authors made significant contributions, besides a few that I have discussed. My book will serve a useful purpose if it helps to stimulate more work in these fields. So that's the introduction on this book on the idea of natural rights. We'll go through the history of the language and all the thought of it, not just right from the Bible and stuff. Another book is John Locke's Theology. It's from Marco. Like I just have a hard copy. I don't have the flap or so. So this book by Jonathan S. Marco. It's just black. It's just plain. It's just tied on the side. Just goes over all the misconceptions of John Locke and his political theology and his personal theology. There's a lot of contents. I'll just read some of the introduction. This is the problem of understanding John Locke. John Locke published The Reasonableness of Christianity in 1695. It is somewhat mainly a theological treatise that starts with explication of certain points of doctrine that was deemed heterodox by traditional Protestants. The bulk of this book contains a painstaking proof of what the fundamental articles of the Christian faith are and why. He does discuss miracles, morality, and other theological and philosophical topics, but interestingly, it perhaps received more attention for what was not in it. Locke avoided making explicit references to standard Christian doctrines, such as the doctrines of the Holy Trinity and the Atonement. Theologian John Edwards lambasted Locke's writings for being Socinian, and this resulted in a protracted debate that pulled in others. Edward attacked Locke in a number of works, and the latter responded in kind. From this debate came two vindications of Locke's theological treatise. The first, A Vindication of Reasonableness of Christianity, was a shorter work, and a second vindication was a comparatively massive work that contained many cutting responses, clarifications of the reasonableness of Christianity, and reveals much of Locke's theological programmatic intent for the reasonableness of Christianity. It says, Locke would soon have other issues. The Bishop Edward Stillingfleet soon accused Locke not of heresy, but for unwittingly paving the way for the heterodox opinions promulgated in the infamous book Christianity Not Mysterious by John Toland. Locke's work were again associated with Socinian thought. Even though Locke defended himself well in both controversies, getting the best of both of his interlocutors in the minds of many, he would never be rid of a dogged association with Socinianism. There is wisdom then in Locke's comment to Stillingfleet amidst their debate. This quote, "It is an observation I have somewhere met with, that whoever is once got into the Inquisition, guilty or not guilty, seldom ever gets cleared out again," end quote. Yet in the minds of some he did escape. Instead of being portrayed as heterodox, he is consistently portrayed as being orthodox, or at least relatively so, by scholars who focus upon the rise of natural religion or deism narrative. There is routinely juxtaposed against John Toland, who was portrayed as appropriating his epistemological fundamentals and not into Socinianism, as was the original charge, but deism. There are a few observations I would like to make about the above account that has pertinence to this present work. First, the application of labels like heterodox and orthodox, and even Socinian, all depend upon against whom Locke is being compared. This is perhaps not so surprising. Second, the context in which Locke wrote and thought were very contentious and complicated. It's convenient to end somewhere, and somewhat efficient to discuss him in the context of the advancement of Socinianism, or in the rise of deism or natural religion, but there is so much more going on during the period. England was rife with theological and philosophical controversy, not to mention similar trends in other spheres of life and thought. So in this present book, we still not only explore the theological and philosophical works of Locke, but also the controversies in which they were forged. Here is section overall argument. The author states, the primary argument of this book is that John Locke's intent for the reasonableness of Christianity was to describe and defend his version of the foundational or fundamental doctrines of Christianity during a very theological and philosophical controversial time, and not his own personal views. Locke desired to describe what makes one a Christian in the simplest and most ironic terms, and to argue for the necessity of Scripture and the reasonableness of God's means of conveying his messages. Both revelation and the promulgated redemption are eminently reasonable. Locke's theological writings, namely Reasonableness of Christianity and its two indications, are an intentionally ecumenical and ironic project written amidst numerous complex theological and philosophical controversies. He argues for the simplicity of the Christian faith to which the uneducated and the laborers could assent. The writings themselves were inadvertently controversial and regarded as a suspect due in part to Locke's refusal to assert more than he thought warranted or desired, his lack of accommodation to the theological terminology and paradigms of his day, a studious avoidance of metaphysical pronouncement, and his failure to realize that most readers will not make a distinction between his personal and programmatic positions. His lack of doctrinal specificity often incensed self-professed orthodox thinkers and nettled metaphysicians who did not recognize or accept the aims of his program. The project was personal or individually focused in the sense that through it he foisted the burden of understanding the Bible and arriving at theological convictions on the autonomous individual, including the uneducated and dismissed, basing one's doctrinal opinions on so-called authorities and epistemologically illegitimate. This advancement of an individualized or personal orthodoxy and its accompanying theological framework for Christians to build upon was intended to refine the Reformation and counter certain post-Reformation trends. Adherence to his project would yield more and better Christians, less negative priestly influence, and thus fewer unhelpful controversies and less sectarianism, and a thriving society. What is more, the claim of his intentional ecumenicity is bolstered by the ease of appropriation of his thoughts by Orthodox and heterodox thinkers alike, a particular point not dealt with here, but demonstrated elsewhere by others. All others of this helps explain the difficulty scholarship has had in labeling Locke along the lines of more traditional Christian sects. Of course, there were certain theological positions and worldviews that he vigorously opposed, such as deism, enthusiasm, and antinomianism. Yeah. Scholarship talks about the problematic tendencies in scholarship. There are a few trends that are present in many works on Locke that have been counterproductive to understanding his writings. First, there are far too many compartmentalized approaches. Locke was not simply an epistemologist or political scientist or theologian, etc. He was a polymath and a rather systematic one. As I will note in the next chapter, even his major, quote, non-theological, end quote, works have strands of theological thought in them. As a case in point, a letter concerning toleration is arguably just as much a theological work as it is a political one. Thus, approaching one of his works, attempting to isolate one of Locke's mental spheres, makes one's reading of him liable to distortion. Second, the theological context of Locke's works is far more complex than most realize. For instance, Calvinism and Arminianism, terms frequently used in recent Locke scholarship, do not describe two monoliths at odds. Not only do these terms reference varied theological movements, but there are also other traditions engaged in Locke's conversation, notably the Lutherans and Anabaptists. Third, there has been a lack of appreciation that Locke's theology and the reasonableness of Christianity is more programmatic than it was personal. He says as much as in reasonableness of Christianity, but there are some reasons many conflict the two. As I will argue, there are important differences between understanding Locke's reasonableness of Christianity as programmatic as opposed to being personal. And what follows, I am less interested in trying to decipher Locke's personal views than in understanding his theological program, its implications, and to some degree how it ties into or is adumbrated in other Lockean works. And it goes on to talk about on the ecumenical intent of reasonableness of Christianity. Talks about focusing on the narratives and singular issues. And it speaks about figures and doctrines that could have been given their own essays. And the approach of this book goes on to talk about the approach on chapters and stuff. What he's attempting to do and all that. And that Locke took his theology seriously, right? Because I know there's opinions of other scholars who tried to say that he was nominally a Christian or something. I think the book argues that he took his Christian faith seriously, so to say, his theological ideas. But anyway, that book's supposed to clear up the problems or misunderstanding of Locke's theology from his personal and what he called the programmatic. Right? I guess that's the political theology versus what he personally believed. But anyway, I hope you find some of these books interesting. And so, yeah, if you like my videos, please like and subscribe. Thank you, and God bless.